She signed papers to save her family. 3 days later, she learned the truth. Those weren't loan documents. They were marriage certificates.
She was already married to a duke she never agreed to wed. And the papers were binding. This is what happened next.
The morning light caught the ink still wet on the marriage certificate, and Lady Genevieve Hartwell felt her world tilt on its axis. She stood in the grand study of Thornwick Manor, her fingers trembling as she gripped the edge of the mahogany desk. The room smelled of beeswax and old leather, scents that had once brought comfort, but now felt suffocating. Across from her, the Duke of Thornwick, Sebastian Aldridge, leaned against the windowsill with the casual confidence of a man who had just won a game she hadn't known she was playing. "I'm not marrying you," she said, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. Sebastian's smile was slow, almost gentle. "You already did." The papers were signed. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Genevieve's mind raced backward through the last 3 days, trying to find the moment when her life had slipped from her control. She remembered her father's study, dimly lit by candlelight. She remembered his hand shaking as he pushed papers toward her, his face gray with something she had mistaken for grief over her mother's recent passing. "Sign these, Genevieve. Trust me. For the family." She had signed. Of course she had signed. She would have done anything to ease the weight of sorrow that had settled over their household like frost. But those papers weren't what she thought they were. "This is fraud," she whispered. "You tricked my father while he was vulnerable, while we were mourning." Sebastian pushed away from the window, and for the first time, Genevieve noticed the shadows beneath his eyes. He looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks. Was it fraud when your father came to me? When he begged me to save your family from complete ruin? The room seemed to shrink. Ruin? Your father has been gambling for years. The estate is mortgaged beyond saving. Without this marriage, without my intervention, you would have lost everything by month's end. Your home, your mother's grave would sit on land owned by strangers. Your younger sister would have no dowry, no prospects, no future. Genevieve felt the blood drain from her face. Her father had always been careful with money, meticulous. The ledgers in his study were pristine, balanced to the penny. But even as she thought it, she remembered the late nights, the closed doors, the trips to London he never fully explained. "You're lying," she said, but the words felt hollow. Sebastian crossed to his desk and withdrew a leather folder. He opened it, revealing page after page of debts, notices, final warnings. The numbers blurred before her eyes. Thousands upon thousands of pounds. The family crest at the top of each letter felt like a brand of shame. "Your father made choices," Sebastian said quietly. "Poor ones. And when those choices caught up with him, when the creditors started circling, he came to me with a proposition, a marriage between our families, an alliance that would clear the debts and secure your future. But I never agreed to this." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "No, you didn't. And that's the part I argued against. I told your father this should be your choice. But he was desperate, Genevieve. Desperate men do desperate things." She looked at him properly then, really looked at him. The Duke of Thornwick had a reputation that preceded him like thunder before a storm. Cold, calculating, a man who had inherited his title at 19 after his father's sudden death and had spent the last decade rebuilding a duchy that had been on the brink of collapse. He was 30 now, unmarried, and ruthlessly efficient in all his dealings. People respected him. Some feared him. But no one called him kind. Yet standing before her now, he didn't look like the heartless aristocrat from the rumors. He looked tired, almost regretful. "Why would you agree to this?" she asked. "What do you gain from trapping a woman into a marriage she doesn't want?" Something flickered across his face, an emotion too quick to name. "I didn't trap you. Your father did. I'm simply the fool who thought I could make it work anyway." And the admission caught her off guard. She studied the papers again, her mind working through the implications. The marriage was legal, binding. Consummated or not, the law recognized it. And if she tried to fight it, to annul it, the scandal would destroy what little remained of her family's name. Her sister, sweet 16-year-old Margaret, would bear the stain of it for the rest of her life. Sebastian seemed to read her thoughts. "You can hate me," he said. "That's your right. But this marriage stands between your family and destitution. Whatever you think of me, whatever you think of this situation, that fact remains unchanged." Genevieve wanted to scream. She wanted to tear the papers to shreds, to run from this manor and never look back. But she thought of her father's trembling hands, her mother's grave in the family plot, Margaret's bright laughter, untouched yet by the weight of adult disappointment. She had been raised to value duty over desire, responsibility over rebellion. Every lesson her mother had taught her, every prayer she had whispered in the chapel, had prepared her for sacrifice. But not this. Never this. "How long have you known?" she asked. "That I didn't understand what I was signing?" Sebastian's silence was answer enough. 3 days, she realized. 3 days since she had arrived at Thornwick Manor, believing she was here to discuss financial arrangements for her father. 3 days since Sebastian had greeted her at the door with a formality that now felt like mockery. 3 days since she had slept in the East Wing, blissfully unaware that she was already the Duchess of Thornwick. The anger came then, pure and bright. "Would you let me believe I was a guest? You sat across from me at dinner and made pleasant conversation about the weather while knowing you had legally bound me to you without my knowledge." "I needed time," Sebastian said, and for the first time, his composure cracked. "I needed to find the right way to tell you, to explain what your father had done without destroying you in the process. There is no right way to tell someone their life has been sold. No, there isn't." The honesty of it disarmed her. Genevieve sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The morning light shifted, casting long shadows across the study floor. Outside, she could hear birds singing, oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding within these walls. "What happens now?" she asked. The question barely more than a whisper. Sebastian moved to the chair across from her, sitting down so they were eye level. "That depends on you. I just told you I don't want this marriage." "I know, but you're also practical enough to see the impossible position we're both in. So I'm offering you a choice. Not the choice you deserved 3 weeks ago, but the only choice available now." Genevieve met his gaze, searching for deception and finding only exhaustion. "What choice?" Sebastian leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "We can make this marriage work, not as a trap, but as a partnership. You need security. Your family needs protection. I need—" He trailed off, and Genevieve wondered what the Duke of Thornwick could possibly need that a marriage of convenience would provide. "You need what?" she pressed. "An heir," he said flatly. "The duchy requires it. But more than that, I need someone who understands what it means to carry a burden you didn't ask for. Someone who won't crumble under the weight of duty." The vulnerability in his voice surprised her. This was not the cold aristocrat of rumor. This was a man who had been forced into his own impossible position and had somehow survived it. "And if I refuse? If I demand an annulment despite the scandal?" Sebastian's expression hardened. but not with anger. With something closer to resignation. Then I'll give you one. I'll absorb the damage to both our names, clear your father's debts as a final gesture, and you'll walk away. Your family will still suffer. The gossip will follow Margaret for years, but you'll be free. The offer was genuine. Genevieve could hear it in his voice, see it in the set of his shoulders. He would let her go. He would take on the full burden of scandal and financial loss rather than force her to stay. It was the first true choice anyone had given her in weeks, and somehow, that made everything harder. Genevieve did not give Sebastian an answer that morning. Instead, she walked the grounds of Thornwick Manor until her boots were caked with mud, and her thoughts had settled into something resembling clarity. The estate stretched for miles, rolling hills dotted with ancient oaks that had stood longer than any title or fortune. Yet she found herself at the edge of a small lake, its surface mirror smooth, reflecting clouds that drifted without purpose or plan. She thought about her mother, about the last conversation they'd had before the fever took her. Promise me you'll take care of your father and Margaret. Promise me you'll be strong enough for all of them. Genevieve had promised. She always promised. The question was whether strength meant walking away or staying. When she returned to the manor, the sun was beginning its descent. She found Sebastian in the library, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence. He looked up when she entered, and she saw something flicker in his expression. Hope, perhaps, or fear. "I need to see my father," she said. Sebastian set down his pen. "I'll arrange the carriage for tomorrow morning." "No, tonight." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll take you myself." The ride to Hartwell House took 3 hours through darkness that pressed against the carriage windows like velvet. Sebastian sat across from her, silent except for the occasional adjustment of his coat. Genevieve watched the countryside blur past and tried to prepare herself for confrontation. But when they arrived, when she stepped into her father's study and saw him slumped in his chair with a glass of brandy clutched in trembling hands, all her rehearsed anger dissolved into something more complicated. Her father looked like he had aged a decade in the weeks since she'd last seen him. His hair had gone completely gray at the temples. His eyes, once sharp and clear, were clouded with something that looked like shame. "Genevieve," he said, rising unsteadily, "I didn't expect you tonight." "You didn't expect me to find out at all," she replied. Her voice was calm, calmer than she felt. Her father's gaze slid to Sebastian, who stood in the doorway like a silent guardian. The Duke inclined his head slightly, but said nothing. This conversation belonged to them alone. "I did what I had to do," her father said finally. "For you, for Margaret, for this family." Genevieve moved to the desk where she had signed those papers just weeks ago. The surface was cluttered now with more notices, more threats. She picked up one at random, a final demand for payment on a loan taken against the house itself. The date gave him 4 more days before foreclosure. "How long?" she asked. "How long have you been drowning?" Her father sank back into his chair. 2 years, maybe 3. I thought I could recover. Each time I thought the next investment would turn it around, the next opportunity. But it never did. No, it never did. Genevieve felt a strange sort of grief settle over her, not for the lost fortune, but for the father she thought she'd known. The careful, methodical man who had taught her to read ledgers, who had insisted on honesty above all else. That man had been a fiction, or perhaps he had simply broken under pressures she had never seen. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Why didn't you ask for help before it came to this?" Her father looked at her with eyes full of misery. "Because I was ashamed. Because I thought I could fix it myself. because the idea of admitting to my daughter that I had failed, that I had gambled away her mother's memory and her future, was more than I could bear. So instead, you sold me. The words hung between them, brutal and true. Her father flinched, as though she had struck him. I made an arrangement, he said weakly, with a good man. Sebastian is honorable. He promised to care for you, to protect you and Margaret. It was the only way. The only way, Genevieve repeated. She thought of all the other choices that might have existed if pride hadn't stood in the way, if honesty had come sooner, if her father had trusted her with the truth instead of trying to shoulder it alone. But those choices were gone now, dissolved into the past like morning mist. She turned to look at Sebastian, still waiting in the doorway. He met her gaze without wavering, and she realized that he had known this moment would come, had known she needed to hear it from her father's own lips before she could decide anything. "Take me back to Thornwick," she said. Her father reached for her. "Genevieve." She stepped away from his outstretched hand. "I need time to think. Time you didn't give me before." The ride back was different. Sebastian sat beside her this time, instead of across, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold night air. He didn't speak, didn't offer platitudes or explanations. He simply existed beside her, solid and real. Halfway through the journey, Genevieve broke the silence. "Tell me about your father." Sebastian stiffened slightly. "Why?" "Because you said you understand carrying burdens you didn't ask for. I want to know what you meant." For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he leaned back against the seat, his eyes focused on something distant and invisible. "My father was brilliant," he said, "charismatic. Everyone loved him. And he threw lavish parties, made grand gestures, lived like the Duchy's coffers were bottomless. By the time he died, we were 6 months from losing everything. I was 19 years old, newly titled, and responsible for hundreds of people whose livelihoods depended on land we could barely afford to maintain." Genevieve watched his profile in the dim light. "What did you do?" "I stopped being young," Sebastian said simply. "I sold everything that wasn't entailed. I dismissed half the staff and worked alongside the other half to keep the estate running. I took loans I'm still repaying. I made decisions that cost me friendships, respect, any chance at a normal life. And I rebuilt it, piece by piece, year by year." "Did you resent him? Your father?" "Every day." Sebastian's voice was quiet but firm. "I resented him for his selfishness, his carelessness, his refusal to see beyond his own desires. But I also understood that resentment wouldn't pay debts or feed tenants. So I channeled it into something useful." Genevieve absorbed this, fitting it against what she knew of him. "Is that why you agreed to help my father? Because you saw yourself in his situation?" "No," Sebastian said, turning to look at her directly. "I agreed because I saw you. Because when your father came to me desperate and broken, he brought a miniature portrait. Your mother's work, I think. And in that portrait, you looked like someone who deserved better than to pay for her father's mistakes with her entire future." The confession settled between them, intimate and unexpected. Genevieve's breath caught. "But I still let him manipulate the situation," Sebastian continued. "Oh, I still let the papers be signed without your full understanding, because I told myself it was for your own good, that you'd see reason eventually. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." The apology was unadorned, direct. Genevieve found herself believing it. The carriage rolled on through darkness, carrying them back to Thornwick. Back to a marriage that existed on paper, but nowhere else. back to a future neither had planned, but both were trapped within, unless they chose differently. Genevieve took a deep breath. "I'll stay." Sebastian went very still. "You will?" "On conditions." "Name them." "First," Genevieve said, "we build this partnership on honesty. No more secrets, no more manipulation. If this marriage is to work, I need to trust you." "Agreed." "Second, I want control over the household accounts. I want to understand exactly where we stand financially, what obligations exist, what can be changed." Sebastian nodded slowly. "The steward will answer to you directly." "Third," Genevieve continued, her voice stronger now, "Margaret must be protected. Whatever happens between us, whatever this marriage becomes, my sister's future remains secure. I'll put it in writing," Sebastian said. "A separate settlement in her name. Untouchable." Genevieve met his eyes, searching for any hint of deception. She found only steady resolve. "Then we have an agreement," she said. Sebastian extended his hand. She looked at it for a long moment before placing her own palm against his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and certain. "Partners," he said. "Partners," she echoed. And in that moment, sealed in darkness between one life and another, Genevieve Hartwell chose her future. Not with resignation, but with deliberate intention. She would make this marriage work, not because she had no other choice, but because she refused to let her father's mistakes or Sebastian's machinations define what came next. She would build something new from these broken pieces. The question was whether Sebastian was truly ready for a partner who would demand equality, honesty, and respect. The answer would come soon enough. The transformation of Thornwick Manor began with ledgers that Genevieve spent her first week as Duchess sequestered in the study, poring over every account book, every contract, every agreement Sebastian had made in his decade as Duke. The steward, a wiry man named Thomas, who had served the family for 30 years, watched her with undisguised skepticism at first. Then she found the discrepancy in the grain contracts. "Your Grace," Thomas said carefully when she summoned him, "those agreements have stood for 8 years." "And they've been bleeding us for 8 years," Genevieve replied, pointing to the numbers she'd circled in red ink. "Look, we're paying transport costs twice, once in the contract price and again as a separate fee. The merchant is taking advantage." Thomas leaned closer, squinting at the figures. Then his weathered face broke into something resembling a smile. "I'll draft new terms immediately, Your Grace." Word spread through the household. The new Duchess understood numbers. The new Duchess asked questions. The new Duchess was not merely decorative. Sebastian watched these changes with an expression Genevieve couldn't quite read. He didn't interfere, didn't question her decisions, but she caught him observing her sometimes with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. 3 weeks into their arrangement, she found him in the garden at dusk. He was examining a rose bush that had gone wild, his sleeves rolled up and dirt on his hands. It was the most informal she'd ever seen him. "The gardener quit last month," he said without looking up. "I haven't found a replacement." Genevieve knelt beside him. "These need pruning. My mother taught me. The dead growth has to be cut away so new blooms can come." She reached for the shears he'd set aside, and their fingers brushed. Sebastian pulled back as though burned. "I can manage," he said. "I know you can," Genevieve replied. "But you don't have to. Not anymore." Something shifted in his expression. Slowly, carefully, he handed her the shears. They worked in silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon. Genevieve cut away dead branches, while Sebastian gathered them into neat piles. It was simple work, physical and honest. There was something healing in it. When they finished, Sebastian looked at the rosebush with satisfaction. "It'll bloom again come spring." "Yes," Genevieve said softly. "It will." He turned to her then, really looked at her in the fading light. "You didn't have to stay," he said. "I would have honored my word, given you an annulment." "I know." "Then why?" Genevieve considered the question. She thought of her father, broken and ashamed. She thought of Margaret, who had visited last week and couldn't stop marveling at the library. She thought of the tenants she'd met, the families whose livelihoods depended on decisions made within these walls. "Because running away wouldn't have solved anything," she said finally. "And because I think we might actually be good at this. Together." Sebastian's eyes widened slightly. "Good at what?" "At being partners. At building something that matters." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was small, tentative, but genuine. "I think you might be right." The seasons turned. Winter came with snow that blanketed the grounds in white silence. Genevieve and Sebastian fell into rhythms that felt increasingly natural. Mornings, reviewing accounts together. In afternoons, managing estate business. Evenings by the fire, reading or simply talking. Margaret came to stay for the Christmas season, bringing light and laughter into rooms that had been too quiet for too long. Genevieve watched Sebastian teach her sister to play chess, patient and kind, as Margaret made mistake after gleeful mistake. "You're good with her," Genevieve said later that night. Sebastian looked up from the book he was reading. "She reminds me of what I missed. Being young without the weight of responsibility." "You carry too much alone," Genevieve said. "You always have. Not anymore." Sebastian set down his book. "You've changed that. Changed everything, really." Genevieve's heart beat faster. "Have I?" He crossed to where she sat, kneeling so they were eye level. "When you arrived here, I thought I was giving you a solution to your father's problems. I didn't realize you would become the solution to mine." "Sebastian, I was alone for so long," he continued. "I convinced myself that was strength, that not needing anyone made me powerful. But you showed me that real strength is letting someone stand beside you, trusting them to carry half the burden." Genevieve reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "We've both been alone. We don't have to be anymore." "No," Sebastian agreed. "We don't." He leaned forward, hesitant, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Their lips met softly, a question and an answer all at once. When they parted, Sebastian rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he whispered. "I didn't plan to. Didn't think I was capable of it anymore. But somewhere between the ledgers and the roses and watching you refuse to let anything defeat you, I fell completely." Genevieve felt tears prick her eyes. "Good. Because I love you too. This stubborn, honorable, impossible man who tried to save me and ended up giving me a life worth living." Spring arrived with those promised roses blooming in wild profusion. The estate flourished under their combined management. Margaret secured an engagement to a kind young baron she'd met at a dinner party Genevieve hosted. Even Genevieve's father, sober now and working to make amends, began to rebuild his relationship with his daughters. On a warm April morning, Genevieve stood in the garden with Sebastian's arms wrapped around her from behind. His hand rested on the slight swell of her belly, where their first child grew. "Are you happy?" Sebastian asked against her ear. Genevieve leaned into him, solid and steady, and hers. I didn't think I could be. When I signed those papers, when I discovered what had happened, I thought my life was over. And now? Now I know it was just beginning. She turned in his arms to face him. We took something broken and made it whole. That's worth more than any fairy tale. Sebastian kissed her, deep and sure. Around them, roses bloomed in red and white and gold, beauty born from careful tending and patient work. Their marriage had begun with deception and desperation, but it had grown into something neither had expected. A partnership built on honesty, a love born from choice rather than circumstance, a future they were writing together, one deliberate decision at a time. And as they stood there in the garden of Thornwick Manor, the Duke and Duchess who had found each other in the wreckage of impossible circumstances, they knew one simple truth. Sometimes the best love stories are the ones you build yourself, piece by careful piece, with patience and trust, and the courage to stay. They had stayed, and in staying, they had found everything.